welcome to the Pre-Snort History Hub. So today we're going to be having a look at the civil rights content. So this is the first civil rights content video, and we're going to be looking at what was life like for African Americans after World War II. So we're kind of setting the scene for the course. So even though our course starts in 1954, it's really important to understand some of that background, okay, what life was like kind of post-World War II. So what was life like for African Americans after World War II? So racial discrimination was a common feature of everyday life in America in the early 1950s, late 40s, early 50s. There were laws which permitted segregation. Okay, so segregation is keeping people separate based on certain features, so either race, gender, etc., religious beliefs. Okay, and there was discrimination, which means kind of discriminating against a person in all walks of life, denying African Americans equality with their fellow white citizens. The Second World War had provided some opportunities for African Americans, and as a result, a few aspects of life did improve. So, mobilization of US industry in the 1940s created employment, and hundreds of thousands of African Americans moved from the South to the North where there were higher wages. So, as you can see on this graph, that the percentage of African American population living in the South of America, so the southern states, slowly starts to decline after around kind of 1910, 1920. There was a bit of this migration before the war, but then it does drop quite a bit. However, there is still the majority of Black Americans are still living in the South. Okay, so it's not like they all suddenly up sticks and move to the North. Some move north, but the majority are still living in the South. So better jobs and higher pay continued into the early 50s, but that just wasn't the case in the South. So there becomes this big kind of north-south divide, okay, where African Americans received poor education in the South, poor housing, had the worst paid jobs, and healthcare was not as good as their white counterparts. So let's have a little bit more of a think about this word segregation. So at the time of the Second World War ending, there were a host of state laws which segregated African Americans from white people in daily life. So these were known as Jim Crow laws. Okay, so if you ever see the name Jim Crow, it's not referring to a specific person, it's referring to these set of laws that segregate African Americans from white people in the South. So the worst cases were obviously in southern states. So it's not that these necessarily were not happening at all in the north. It's just that they were happening a lot more often, and it became much more of a way of life in the south. Okay. Intermarriage was against the law in most southern states, so that means black people marrying white people was forbidden. Okay, and towns were segregated into black areas and white areas. So it's not just residential areas that were segregated; it was public places as well. So places like hospitals, cinemas, shops, hotels, parks, libraries, theatres, anywhere that you might go, places we still go today, were completely segregated. So, for example, in movie theatres, there might be one theatre where black people can sit, one theatre where white people can sit, or it might be split, so white people can go to the front, black at the back. Okay, transport was also segregated, but it was in education where the policy kind of caused the biggest concern. Okay, so a lot of these Jim Crow laws come from this famous legal case called Plessy versus Ferguson that happened in 1896. So we're kind of going quite a bit of the way back, and this is why kind of the consequences of the Plessy versus Ferguson case are why a lot of these Jim Crow laws were put in place. So African American children could legally be educated in separate schools, provided that the schools provided an education which was equal to that of white children. So that was what the Plessy versus Ferguson case in 1896 ruled. So the Supreme Court judged that if separate conditions for black people and white people were equal, then segregation was constitutional. So this whole idea of separate but equal grew and kind of gave the policy of segregation a clear basis. Okay, so a lot of these segregation policies were based on this idea of separate but equal that followed on from the Plessy versus Ferguson case in 1896. Okay, so I've just put this cartoon on here because it just kind of shows that even though they were supposed to be providing separate but equal facilities, quite often those facilities were not equal at all. Okay, and the same went for schools. So as you can see on the left, it says car for white folks, and it's quite nice and pristine looking and quite big, and on the right, Jim Crow car. So that's the segregated part for black people, and it doesn't look as nice. They're clearly not equal, are they? Okay. It was the same in education. They were providing separate education, but whether they were equal is a big question mark. And in most cases, they were not equal. So discrimination, let's look at this idea. So racial discrimination is the practice of treating a person less fairly because of their race or their skin colour. Okay, it could be other things as well, but we're focusing on race and skin colour here. So as a result of segregation, there also developed discrimination, which meant that African Americans experienced problems in finding houses, jobs, educational opportunity was not as great for them. It was often this kind of vicious cycle. So poor opportunities in education and discrimination led to jobs of much lower statuses in adulthood for African Americans, with large numbers being restricted to kind of menial and unskilled positions. So economic discrimination meant that African Americans received lower wages. They were therefore unable to afford houses in better neighborhoods. And the cycle kind of continues then with their children and their children. So discrimination and segregation kind of produces this like vicious cycle of oppression, meaning that most Black people had no way of escaping their lower class status at all. Okay, so this is just some examples, some real pictures from the 1950s and 60s that show how discrimination was in action. So here you can see a water fountain for coloured only, meaning for Black people only. Again, a job advert, help wanted, white only. So this poor man that's looking at this advert clearly can't apply for this job. And a laundry company that will only wash for white people. So voting rights as well. So in addition to segregation and discrimination, African Americans had to endure being disqualified in a number of other ways. So there was the idea of the 15th Amendment to the American Constitution, which did grant African American men the right to vote by declaring the right of citizens in the US to vote not be denied by the US or by any state on account of race, colour, or previous servitude, which means slavery. However, many states did introduce poll taxes, literacy tests, which were designed to prevent African Americans from voting. So most African Americans were unable to pay the poll tax because they were too poor. Many could not read or write because there were few schools that existed. So there was very poor quality of education for them, very basic literacy skills. And in Alabama, in order to register to vote, a person had to read out loud to the registrar a section of the US Constitution. Then the applicant had to write out a different section of it. Then there were written questions that were kind of impossible to answer in some cases, like how many bubbles in a bar of soap? And how are you meant to know what bar of soap? So even if the literacy tests were passed, African Americans would be subjected to violence, intimidation to prevent them from casting their vote anyway. So even if they could overcome all of those hurdles, pay the poll tax, pass the literacy test, they were often subjected to violence when they got to the voting booth anyway. Okay, so here's an example of a 1965 Alabama literacy test, okay, that they would have to answer. So it's not, for somebody that's got very little education, it's quite difficult to answer. Okay, so that's your first video. Don't forget to subscribe to the Pre-Snore History Hub.